Thank you everyone for joining us today for this special event called How Memory Makes It Harder to Fight COVID-19. This event is part of the APS Global Collaboration on COVID-19, which has been bringing together psychological scientists and other specialists from diverse fields to understand how psychological science has been applied to combat the pandemic. Also, how to discuss the ways psychological science hasn't been used, but perhaps should have been, and identify gaps in our collective knowledge, as well as future avenues for research within psychological science and in collaboration with experts from different fields so that society is better equipped to handle future health crises. My name is Ludmila Nunes. I'm the science advisor at the Association for Psychological Science. If you aren't familiar with APS, we are an international organization of psychological scientists, professionals, and students who are dedicated to advancing scientific psychology for the benefit of science and society. We are very pleased to have you here today. We have a mix of APS members here and folks who aren't members yet, so please do consider joining APS for access to other events like this and much more. You can find more information about APS at psychologicalscience.org. With that, I will turn to Dr. Marianne Gary, who is the leader of the APS Fundamental Memory Science and COVID-19 Working Group. Dr. Gary, please take it away.
Thanks, Ludmila, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're watching today. My name's Marianne Gary. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. I'm chairing this event. I'm also, as Ludmila said, the chair of the APS Working Group on Fundamental Memory Science and COVID-19. And before we start, I want to thank everybody at APS for putting this event together, particularly Ludmila Nunes, Emily Proppy, and Andy DeSoto, who's just recently left to go to the NSF. And also thank you to my colleagues on the APS Working Group on Memory, with whom I'm working on some broader questions: Lorraine Hope, Jennifer Tallarico, and Rasmussen, Linda Levine, and Suparna Rajaram. To all of you watching us on the stream, and there are a lot of people watching around the world, psychological scientists and just members of the general public, please hop on over the chat at YouTube. It's easy to make a free account. If you don't have one, tell us where you're watching from today. And a special hello to Dr. Tallarico's class from Lafayette and Dr. Baltasari's class at USF. I understand A is for everybody. Let me introduce today's panel, tell you a bit about our background. My expertise is in human memory. I'm particularly interested in how we come to believe or remember things that just aren't real. And in my lab, we do work with implications for the law and clinical psychology. If you're a regular listener of Allison Sheridan's show, or indeed if you're Allison Sheridan herself, you will know me as the crusher of dreams, because I'm always telling Allison's audience that memory can go really, really badly wrong. Now, one of my colleagues at APS on the APS Working Group is joining us today. That's Lorraine Hope, who's a professor of applied cognitive psychology at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. Well, Lorraine's an expert in minimizing the memory problems that I just described and sometimes create. So her expertise is on how best to obtain detailed, accurate information, what we sometimes call intelligence, about things that happened already or things that might happen in the future. And she works with law enforcement around the world, including organizations with three-letter abbreviations. I'm also very pleased to introduce Marcel Salate, who's a professor and PI of the Digital Epidemiology Lab at EPFL, which is the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Marcel is trained as a biologist, a geneticist, and an epidemiologist. And almost a decade ago, he recognized that our digital devices, like our iPhones, are capturing and storing information that would help epidemiologists understand what people are doing in the face of a public health challenge. And he and his lab are a big part of the reason why your phone helps with contact tracing, exposure notifications, and so on. And I personally am exceedingly excited to introduce to you Tom Merritt. Tom is an award-winning tech journalist, a host of regular tech shows, including the Daily Tech News Show, that has more than 50,000 listeners all around the world. Tom is based in Los Angeles. He has an unrivaled ability to identify important tech issues and explain them to ordinary mortals. And I first learned about the ups and downs of digital contact tracing from Tom when I was listening to the Daily Tech News Show back in 2020. So in many ways, Tom is really responsible for inspiring this event. And what about you? If you're watching us live on YouTube, please let us know in the chat where in the world you're watching from today. So we're going to do this discussion in 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about the promise and pitfalls of contact tracing from epidemiology and from psychological science. Then we're going to talk about the unforeseen, although, maybe not, hindsight bias alert, problems because of how we think about technology. And then we're going to open it up to questions. So in the meantime, again, if you have a comment or a question, please head on over to the live chat on YouTube. You'll need an account or to be signed in, but it's free. Okay, so let's start with how traditional methods of contact tracing work. Marcel.
Sure, yeah. So traditional methods are actually fairly straightforward, right? You have an infected person and your job is to break the infection chains, right, going out from that person. So one of the first things you want to do is find out who that person has been in contact with. And you do that by asking the person, right? So who have you been in contact with? And then of course, contact, right, depends on, the disease. And in the case of COVID-19 pandemic, it was literally just everyone, right? Everyone you've even been close to. And so you're asking people to identify their contacts, and then you try to contact them and say, hey, you have been exposed. So first of all, take care of your health and watch out for yourself and check your symptoms. But please stay at home, right, in quarantine, because you might be passing this thing on without actually knowing that you have it. So that's, in a nutshell, how contact tracing classically, traditionally works.
So, Marcel's description of contact tracing reminds me of some of the real life problems, we study in psychological science. I'm thinking about the fragility of our memories. So contrary to a popular myth out there, Elizabeth Loftus. Well, I'm just about to mention Elizabeth Loftus. Memory does not work like a camera. That's a myth. Instead, when you try to remember something, you bring to mind a bunch of related thoughts and images and feelings and try and stitch them together. And if it feels like a real memory, you call it a real memory. Now, all of this is happening in the background. You're hardly ever aware that you're doing this kind of thing. But the key point for our discussion today is that you stitch together these thoughts and images and feelings from sources other than your own actual experience or in addition to your own actual experience. So things you've imagined, things you've read, things even other people have told you, things you've seen on television. And so if all of that gets stitched together and it feels like a real memory, you think it's a real memory, then we might have a problem, because memories can be really accurate or accurate enough, or we can have all the way up to a full-blown false memory. And as Beth Loftus once said, your memory works kind of like a Wikipedia page. You can go in and change it, but so can other people. And Lorraine, these features of memory and of contact tracing also remind me of some of the work that you've done showing the challenges we have in obtaining accurate and complete information from people.
Yes, absolutely, Marianne. And quite a number of the things you said just then resonate very clearly with the challenge of getting detailed and accurate accounts from memory. It's surprisingly difficult, even when interviewees are fully cooperative. So, there's decades of research on how people interview or how to interview people about what they've seen, what they've experienced in forensic and policing contexts. So bottom line is that people generally underestimate how difficult the task of remembering and reporting actually is. Ultimately, there are 5 main challenges, and these, I think, we've talked about this a lot. These apply to the contact tracing context as well. So we can think a little bit about interviewees in contact tracing interviews as witnesses to their own behavior. And therefore, they have some of the following problems we expect in any kind of witnesses. So they, even if they're cooperative, they might leave out information, they omit information. And even if they want to be helpful, they're not going to spontaneously retrieve or report complete memories, even if the information is salient. Even when they do report memories, they may be imprecise, so they don't provide enough useful detail or actionable information. Third, when people do remember information, they can also make mistakes, or like you just said, they can make minor distortions, which, don't make a lot of difference generally to how we go about in the world, or they can have major false memories. Witnesses have different abilities. So some witnesses have different vulnerabilities that make it difficult for them to remember information. And that can be to do with age, intoxication, and different kinds of vulnerabilities they may have just as a function of who they are. And finally, witnesses can be reluctant to report what they recall.
Right. And then, of course, we can add actual COVID into the mix, and its effects on cognition.
Yeah, absolutely. And although this research isn't in the interviewing fields, there's plenty of information and research that suggests that pain disrupts performance on all kinds of cognitive tasks, and acute illness like viral infection, that's known to impair executive function and working memory. So these kind of factors associated with being ill might hinder somebody's ability to remember information. So yes, the effects of being ill with COVID, which if you're speaking to a contact tracer, you likely are likely to impair our ability to remember as well. And the real issue is that from an interviewing point of view, that's the area I work in, contact tracing protocols to date do not really appear to have taken these kind of memory challenges into account, or used methods that are going to promote memory and retrieval. So there is some interesting research on this that's come out recently, conducted by Jacqueline Evans and our colleagues, and they looked at whether or not a contact tracing protocol informed by cognitive principles known to enhance memory would actually improve the reporting of contacts. And sure enough, they, quite unsurprisingly, I think, they found that it did. And they found that increase in information with a good interview protocol increased reporting by about 50%.
So for a while, it seemed like traditional kind of contact tracing was among the best weapons we had in the fight against this pandemic. But of course, the virus can often move faster than contact tracers can. And then you add in the other problems that we've just been discussing, that human memory can be incomplete and it can be unreliable, and that the effectiveness of contact tracing hinges on getting information that is complete and reliable. And so to people like us, me and Lorraine and others who study the science of memory, the enterprise of contact tracing is hard, and made harder because we need to get this information from people who probably don't feel well, and they're kind of like witnesses to an invisible event, which is the transmission of this virus. And that's why digital contact tracing has so much promise, because your iPhone basically, or your phone, does some of the paying attention and remembering for you. So Marcel, can you tell us a bit about what digital contact tracing is and what's so good about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so all the points you mentioned, right, are relevant to digital contact tracing, but let's add to the mix also that in this case, right, we from the beginning assumed that you are going to infect people that you're not even aware are there, right? Let's say you're on a bus or on a train, right? So the basic idea of digital contact tracing was essentially to support classical contact tracing, and to do that with the phone, because your phone has Bluetooth built into it, right? All modern phones, smartphones have that. And Bluetooth was obviously never built for that. It was built to connect devices to one another over the air. But in this case, you can use the strength of the Bluetooth signal to estimate distance. And so then you can say, okay, here I hear a couple of phones that are nearby, or here. And so I should somehow, right, later be able to inform those phones that they have been close, right, in contact, so to speak, with a phone that belongs to someone who's now been tested positive. And of course, if you think about this from a technology perspective, there's some challenges, but the biggest one to us was the privacy implications of that, right? Such a system could quickly be abused if it's run centrally, right, by central authorities. You may trust your government, I may trust mine, but we were aware that these could potentially become global developments and global protocols, and indeed they have now, right, with exposure notification. So we were really mindful to make sure this would be privacy preserving. And so then in the end, right, the idea was that, okay, this is then going to be fast for all the reasons you mentioned, but it's also really preserving the privacy. And with that, right, we could get sort of two birds with one stone. Now, of course, now we're 2.5 years in, right? Remember, this was developed around March, and then starting to be deployed in May. In June, you had the first live apps in certain countries. And there's data now coming in. In fact, the data that you're seeing here is from what I still consider one of the most important papers coming out of the UK, which also has developed an app that is built on this protocol. And what you can see here, right, is the app uptake in different locations in the UK, and it's just colored right accordingly. So if the app uptake was very high, then it goes more into the yellow. And so if you look at the panel on the right, that's really interesting, right? That's in the second wave of 2020. Remember, this was the really deadly one, and there was no vaccine. So this is where contact tracing we would really hope it would help. And what you can see here, right, is that for each location, you can see the incidence curve, right? How many cases? And you'll note here already visibly that the curves that are low, low numbers of cases tend to be rather bright, meaning the app uptake was high. And the other ones turn out to be rather dark, meaning the app uptake was low. And of course, all of that is statistically analyzed in great detail in that paper. But it showed that the system worked really well. The percentage of people contacted who did indeed turn out to have caught COVID was 6%. You may think, wow, that's not a lot, right? 100 people that have been sent into quarantine, only 6 turn out to be truly positive. But the fact is that this is a good rate, and it's in fact exactly the same rate that was observed in traditional contact tracing. So same yield, but what they also showed is that the number of contacts was higher by a factor 2.5. So this had a higher yield, but a much same precision, but a much higher yield. So this was one example of a really useful system.
Oh, great. And I hate to ask this, but what about what it didn't do so well?
Yeah, what it didn't do so well, I mean, I think the technology held up well. There were some concerns about privacy, even though this was a highly privacy preserving technology, but there were concerns. I think this is just a fact, right? People are now understandably concerned about digital surveillance, right? In a sort of post-Snowden world, that's understandable. But then, this wasn't convincingly communicated just how privacy preserving this is. And even in places where it was, maybe people didn't quite believe it. But now, right, 2.5 years later, have you ever heard out of any sort of major hack of this data? No, because it's so safe, because it's completely decentralized. But that was just hard to communicate. And I think that will be better next time. The other thing that was hard was actually, right, remember these apps were dropped sort of into healthcare systems, public health systems that were still deeply analog, right, and very non-digital. And so the whole system around it, right, sort of getting a code to activate the app once you had a test, and then being sure everything happens properly with quarantine, all of that stuff didn't go very well in a lot of places. And so the whole pipeline around it, with this digital infrastructure, it was difficult. And I think next time we would have the experience everywhere in the world to do this more efficiently.
Thanks. All right. We are live with the APS Global Collaboration on COVID-19. Our topic today is the psychological science of memory and what it means for fighting a pandemic and modern digital contact tracing. If you've got a question or a comment, go ahead and post that in the live YouTube chat. Marcel, you've said, and also in some of our show prep, you've said that there wasn't much thought that was put into the behavioral side of things, which makes sense. So, there's a little element of, I don't want to be Monday morning quarterbacking here, but how people would think about digital contact tracing, or even maybe the public health messages that would help support digital contact tracing so it could be maximally successful. So as this consequence, it sounds like there was this somewhat of a disconnection between the capability of these digital tools and how people reacted to them or used them. So put another way, on the one hand, digital contact tracing gave us this technology that made the accuracy of our memories less of an issue than with manual contact tracing. But on the other hand, the same technology maybe helped to create some new problems. I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about how maybe looking forward and a better understanding or appreciation of basic cognitive psychology. So how we think and how we make sense of information and new things could have helped.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I can give you two examples. I think the most obvious one was that I guess people didn't really think very deeply about how would the individual perceive the whole system, right? And not only how it works, but what's going to happen to me. I mean, the joke, at least in Switzerland here on the App Store, was that the app was like reverse Tinder, right? You would be together, and then the app does something, and then you're alone. And so I think that, that wasn't quite appreciated. Also given the fact that this was the most highly upvoted comment. Then there were other things, right? So for example, in Switzerland, we built the app to be super boring. Like it should just never do anything, but except when you're sick or, when you've been exposed. But that maybe wasn't a good idea. I think our colleagues in Germany, for example, had better ideas there, and their app was sort of constantly signaling what the situation was, right? It was green when you had a low risk, as you can see on the screen here. It was orange when there was a potential exposure, and it was red when there was a clear exposure. So it signaled constantly that, hey, the app is working, whereas people in Switzerland often said, I don't know if this app is working because it's never doing anything, right? So these are things, right, we hadn't really taken into account, and that we absolutely should do next time something like this will be needed.
So whenever I want to get a better understanding of technology, I listen to Tom Merritt. And Tom, one of the issues that you really focus on in your writing, in your podcasts, maybe not so much in your science fiction work, is how all sorts of people react to technology, like understanding it or not, seeing it positively or negatively, the misconceptions we have, using it, avoiding it. What kind of reaction do you see when it comes to these technologies like digital contact tracing?
Yeah, well, thank you, Marianne. I'm coming to this fairly anecdotally, so I'm talking about what I saw both in the media and in my own audience for Daily Tech News Show. But I think it's not a surprise to say that there is a lot of suspicion and a lot of lack of trust, both in companies, in governments, but also just in technology. And Marcel, referred to Snowden earlier. That sort of laid the groundwork that then got projected onto Facebook and Google and Amazon. And so telling people at length how exposure notification worked, how it stayed on device, what information it actually transmitted, what information it didn't, how it was under your control, didn't really stick. People still didn't quite trust it. I had several conversations with people where I would explain, but see, this is all it's doing. And they were still like, yeah, but I don't know. So it was a matter of trust. There was also a lot of criticism of the tech itself from tech enthusiasts out there saying, yes, I know it's supposed to work well, but I don't trust these companies. I don't like that it was Google and Apple that got involved in the exposure notification system. There was a little bit of confusion with certain countries trying their own systems first that may or may not have had technical issues, and then people heard about those issues and confused them with other systems. And really, people just wanted it to be easy to use. They wanted to be able to trust it, and they wanted not to have to work hard to either understand it or to use it. So there was a misunderstanding of what it was and what it was trying to do. And I think until you have a general vocabulary of what to trust, until you have examples where people say, oh, well, I trust that kind of technology, which we are just beginning to get, it was really hard to get people to understand what was trustworthy and what wasn't. And when there was a choice, they just chose not to trust.
The vocabulary, there are a number of instances in which we might have exacerbated problems with language that, conveyed restriction and reduction of freedom and government overreach rather than helping. I mean, Marcellus so that even the phrase contact tracing suggests overreach and, lockdown, right? Rather than keeping your network of friends and family safer, or friendly words like bubble. And those of you who are cognitive psychologists know that the name we give to something really matters, right? Especially when you're taking in new information. It changes, 1, what you pay attention to, 2, how you make sense of it, and 3, it even can change what you remember. There's a classic experiment that illustrates this point really nicely. And if you are a cognitive psychologist, I'm just going to venture that this is one of your most favorite experiments ever. So here, everyone reads this passage. It's about 2 kids who skip school. They go to hang out at one kid's house. Their parents are really well off. One's giving the friend the tour, and you can see the kind of things he's pointing out, all these things in the house. All right. And the manipulation here, this is Pitchert and Anderson, by the way, the manipulation here is that you read this passage from either the perspective of a burglar who's looking to rob this house, or a home buyer, a potential home buyer is thinking about buying this house. And as it happens, when you ask people later what they remember, burglars remember this kind of information, right? Mom's never home on Thursdays. You can't see the house from the road. Here's bikes, coin collection, fancy things, right? If you read this from the perspective of a home buyer, you remember something different. What you remember is other things: new stone siding, landscaped yard. The house has just been painted, but the basement is damp and musty. So, the kinds of things that we tell people, if we step back slightly, the kinds of things we tell people really matter. And so now we have issues of trust, understanding. Even what we call something might influence how people make sense of important technology in digital contact tracing. So let's throw a few questions to the panel. If you have some questions and you're on YouTube, please just ask away. Tom, how come people are okay with Google tracking their every movement, even their cell phone provider doing the same thing, and then freaking out about contact tracing?
Yeah, and even further than that, freaking out about Google surveilling them while continuing to use Google's products, and yet not picking up contact tracing. There's a saying in technology that my friend Brian Brushwood likes to throw around a lot: convenience trumps fidelity. Google is there and easy to use. For search, it's just a text box and it gives you what you want. So while you may have a principled objection to Google's surveillance, it's easy to use. And contact tracing felt hard to use. Even when it wasn't that hard to use, it was new, and it was something that I think people felt like, well, I'd have to learn how to use it. And new things are always scarier than old things. So the perceived benefit of using a Google or a Facebook is, well, I get to see the photos of my niece, or I get that information on the upcoming concert super quick, or I get free email. The benefits of contact tracing were I might find out I'm sick. And that's not a real positive benefit. So I think the perceived benefits of technology keep people using it despite their resistance. And there might be something indicated there that I would guess shows why they were more resistant to picking up contact tracing.
Any other thoughts from the panel? Marcel, did you want to say something?
No, I mean, I think I agree with that. I mean, ultimately, right, the pitch was really, okay, what are you getting out of this, right? This was constantly mentioned to me, and to some extent, I'm still puzzled by it, because, well, which part are you not getting, right? We're in a pandemic and we're trying to break the transmission chains, but I realized, right, that I was there, looking at things from a very technical epidemiological level and not really understanding what people's concerns are. But to this day, right, it's not clear to me how we would actually have changed that, because that's just how it works, right?
Yeah. On the APS working group, we've talked a lot about collective memories, which is how groups remember their past. And that group can be a culture, it can be a country, it can be a family. It's just some kind of social group. And I realize it's kind of an unusual use of the word memory. So collective memories aren't necessarily from your personal experience. They're more like stories that say, countries tell themselves about their past. So you can think of World War II, for instance. So lots of people in lots of countries have collective memories of World War II without being in World War II. And they're different across different countries, right? And we know this from work with people like Roddy Roediger, Sharda Umanov. And like most memories, collective memories can change over time. So even within a country. So for instance, collective memories of World War II often change in a country from one generation to the next. And we can think about collective memories of the last worldwide pandemic, which was the 1918 influenza pandemic, which lasted a few years, hurt some groups harder than others, as pandemics are wont to do. And here in New Zealand, this pandemic hit Māori people, the indigenous people of New Zealand, particularly hard. And this is an image of a Kaumatua, a tribal elder. He's pointing to what looks like sand dunes, but it's a burial site. And he said, our elders never talked about this to us as kids. We were just told these were sand dunes that were tapu, which means sacred, and that we couldn't play there. And it's not until he was 30 years old that his elders finally shared their collective memory with him about how the influenza pandemic had ripped through their community, killing young people and old people alike. And though he understands why, nobody really wanted to talk about what happened. Today, he says there's a big gap in the collective memory of a lot of Māori, particularly young people. And this Kaumatua and other tribal elders thought that was creating problems. And what you see is that young Māori have a hard time understanding the unique threats that COVID presents to their community. They have exceedingly low vaccination rates. So this Kaumatua and others made it their job to share these collective memories and spur their community to action. And I think this example illustrates the idea that collective memories, good or bad, can serve functions that are good or bad. And on the working group, we've been talking about what you might think of as an ironic effect of collective memory. You know, that some countries escaped the worst of the pandemic, not because they were awesome, because there were some countries that really did the right thing, but because of idiosyncratic factors. And so like just take New Zealand, for example. We are in the middle of nowhere, in case no one's ever flown here and noticed that. And we spent 2 years being in a terrarium with a lid on. So that solves a lot of problems. But I worry that here in New Zealand, for instance, our collective memory will be, we were awesome, which means we're going to take away the wrong lessons and do some terrible planning for a future pandemic. And Lorraine, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
So I've been more recently taking a look at some of differences in cross-cultural issues, in memory, in interviewing responses and so forth. So I thought I'd take a look at see if there was some work on cross-cultural differences in terms of response and outcomes. And it seems there's been some great work done on the concept of cultural tightness and looseness. And this concept reflects the degree to which some cultures have very strict social norms. So they're either explicit or implicit rules in the culture that really constrain behavior and are associated with punishments for deviance. And there's some work that shows that variations in this tightness-looseness construct is actually associated with historical experiences. So in this way, it fits a little bit with what you were just saying about collective memory, in that those cultures have historical experience of ecological disasters, disease, resource scarcity, invasion. So those that are tight have these experiences, and therefore they have stricter social norms. And so I think we could look at a slide that just, these have been tracked and rated across a few different cultures by Michelle Gelfand and a huge team across 33 different countries. And you can see the range, so that the red bars right up at the end, these are those with the tightest social norms, right down at the other end, more loose to average social norms. So that's an interesting concept, because most recently, Michelle and her team looked at the relationship between this construct of cultural tightness and health outcomes during the pandemic. And what they found in this really interesting piece of work is that compared with cultures that had this high level of cultural tightness, nations with high levels of cultural looseness, like the US, like the UK, were estimated to have 5 times the number of cases and almost 9 times the number of deaths, when a range of other important factors were controlled for. So many things like rates of equality, access to vaccines, age of population, and so on and so forth. So in other words, these nations with these high levels of cultural tightness were better able to limit cases and deaths than nations that were looser. And they suggested that this might be because those cultures were better and more readily able, as a result possibly of historical experiences, to adopt cooperative behaviors. So not all of them did wonderfully, and not all looser cultures did badly, but it was an interesting association between those two things that I think is quite informative going forward for how different cultures, different tightness, looseness, dimensions in a culture might be part of what you need to think about when planning an intervention.
All right. So Marcel or Tom, does this fit with anything that you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, actually, so this concept, right, of, okay, things are going well, so therefore you're going to be badly prepared next time, is actually very well known in public health, right, in the context of vaccines, right? I mean, places where diseases are rampant, right, or times when the diseases are rampant and the vaccines come on the scene, well, they're hailed as heroes, right? And, the uptake is just through the roof, right? And you have these pictures of people queuing. The vaccines work, the disease goes away. A generation later, right, you find a large fraction of the population not wanting to get vaccinated. And, right, it's the exact same, in some sense, the same phenomenon, right, that of what you just experienced, right, in the past 10, 20, 30 years will really shape how you're reacting to a situation. So resonates strongly.
Tom?
Yeah, the thing that strikes me, reminds me the most about is memes, the spreading of memes, and it feels like just from the outside that a country that has gone through more difficulties probably has what we wouldn't call memes because they're not funny GIFs on Twitter, but has cultural memes that teach you how to survive, and those behaviors can be borrowed for other crises. And so I don't know if there's a clue there in how to get people to prepare better for another pandemic. Maybe there are some funny gifts that we could make for that. But there obviously is a connection there of when you see other behaviors that work, your society seems to more readily adopt them, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about the next pandemic. What is the one thing we need to do better next time? Marcel.
The one thing that's hard, but I would, generally I would say preparing, and this sounds a little dry, right? But this is what the public health community has been preaching for 100 years, and no one was quite eager to listen. But these things, right, they have to become second nature, and then you pull the plans out of the drawer, and people will know what they're talking about. Here in this case, right, everybody had to learn from scratch what it means to go through a pandemic, right? And of course, arguably, it's hard when the last really bad one was 100 years ago. I get that, but still, right? If for now, let's hope we can keep that memory for some time, and then reinforce it continuously with, doing some sort of fire drills, right? And helping us remember what we'll actually, should do in order to keep societies open and still healthy.
Lorraine?
Yeah, I like the way Marcel has put that in a memory context. It's helped people remember the pandemic so that they know how to behave the next time, I guess. I think as well that there could have been better work done on risk messaging, to make sure it was relevant to the audience, and the cultural norms of that audience, because that is bound to vary when the culture is tight or loose. If I'm allowed a second one, I think, if we're going to do contact tracing, please talk to people who work on interviewing, because that would certainly help.
Tom?
Yeah, I know we talked a lot about the lack of trust in technology in general and overcoming that, but I also think there was a lack of trust in the messaging, at least certainly here in the United States. The thing I heard over and over from people was, well, they told us not to get masks and then they told us to get masks. And to me, looking closely, it was perfectly understandable why they said the thing they said in the first place and then changed. But the message was muddled and it caused a lack of trust. So we did great this time around in having engineers harness technology to do some things that we would never have been able to do without the technology. And I don't think we should dismiss that just because it didn't work as well as maybe we would have hoped. But I would look at technology from end to end this next time and say, don't just bring the engineers, look at what product managers, look at what product marketers do as well to get people to accept their applications and their technology, and also try to add on next time a replication of what Apple does to get people so excited about their products, to get people excited about contact tracing. It's a bigger deal, right? It's a lot less fun to get people contact tracing, but if you apply some of those lessons, I think that would help. And I'm not certain that those same kinds of people were enlisted this time around.
Maybe names like contact tracing Max Ultra.
Yeah. Or exposure notification.
So that
I'm not a marketer, so.
Surprise. One of the things that Tom pointed out is something that is also a memory issue, which is the things you learn first, anchor, and what we call them, anchor, how you're going to update or not. And there was very little in the way of, I'm telling you what we've discovered so far. It might change. It was just, here's the thing and do the thing, right?
But this, can I interject here? Because
Sure.
I think this is a critical point, right? And, when I said we should prepare, I mean, it's not only prepare like, let's do fire drills, but exactly also for that, right? We didn't have the time, right? Because otherwise people would have loved to sit down, right, with all kinds of special, with people who have all kinds of expertise. But in this case, right, there just wasn't the time, again, because we weren't prepared.
Yeah.
And likewise, right, what you just said, this is so true. I noticed it with almost everything, vaccines, masks, right, social distancing. The first message is the most important. And that shouldn't be the case, right? We shouldn't be in such a situation where whoever gets the word out first wins the narrative for the next 2 years. And again, if we prepare this regularly, then we won't have that problem because people already understand the basic concepts.
Yeah, right. All right. So we have some questions from the audience. If you have a question or a comment, please head over to the live chat on YouTube. You'll need to be signed in with your account, but you can make one of those for free. So our first question is from Jenny Redifer at Western Kentucky University, wants to know about the impact of false information, say from social media, Fox News, on the reliability of memory for information about COVID-19. So this follows on nicely from what we were just talking about. Lorraine?
Yeah, I mean, this exactly fits with what Marcel was just saying. So, and we don't need to go to Fox News or anywhere else to start talking about the misinformation. At the start, when there was no time and there was an absence of information, absence of proper scientific understanding of what the problem was, even kind of trusted sources were providing information that subsequently, wasn't perhaps, borne out. So the WHO was suggesting that, not suggesting, was issuing statements to the extent that the virus isn't transmitted in the air, it's transmitted by droplets, mask needs to block droplets. So wash your hands, do the bump elbows, stay 2 meters or 6 feet apart. When in reality, that really wasn't borne out as we learn more, I guess. The reality is ventilation is important. Air filtration is important. Indoor areas without ventilation are risky, and you need a decent mask. And so, as Marcel was saying, that kind of early misinformation is difficult to shake. And I completely agree that we need to, improve scientific understanding of science and how it's incremental and how things may change as our knowledge improves and so forth, to mean that people just don't get locked into those singular narratives that, you know, are not beneficial to them over time. And so, you know, the same thing happened here in the UK. There was, you know, the same kind of advice and the same kind of pattern. That's what we knew at the time.
Yeah, and of course the collective memory can be that's what we knew at the time, right? But we can compare that with what the Japanese were telling their citizens at the same time. Where they were saying it's contradicting the World Health Organization, contradicting the advice from the UK, right? So saying stay away from closed spaces. This is what our data are suggesting. And, you know, why is any of this a problem? Well, again, when it comes to the influence of new information, what you encounter first sets the tone. It matters a lot. And if you encounter misinformation early on, as a lot of people did, it's hard to update. And that's how, as scientists, we just think, well, of course you update. But in general, people don't work that way. Tom?
Yeah. There's a difference between fighting disinformation and misinformation. And I feel like the questioner was sort of asking about both. Misinformation is a lot easier to combat. On Daily Tech News Show, we do it all the time. We're constantly combating somebody reading a headline or a headline that misdirects you about something. Lower stakes stuff often, you know, about specs of a new Samsung Galaxy phone or something like that. But with exposure notification, we took care to lay out, this is how it works. We provided primary sources, and we, being trusted by our audience, were able to say, just look at this. Here's a question I know you have. Here's what we know about how it works. This is what Bluetooth can do. This is what it can't do. This is how to tell if something is, you know, leaky security-wise from your phone and whether it's being traced. Here are the experts in security to pay attention to as they audit this on your behalf. So it was a question of trying to provide context to people. And I think that is easier. Misinformation is easier to combat in that way by providing, if you're a trusted source, providing something for people to look at and say, okay, yeah, no, I understand. And you addressed my question. You're not just telling me I'm wrong. You're explaining why, you know, I may have heard one thing and a different thing is happening, specifically with exposure notification. Disinformation, on the other hand, is a lot harder to combat because it's intentionally trying to fool someone, and persuading someone is a lot harder than informing them.
Yeah. All right. Our next question, Maurice Regan, is memory for COVID different from memories we have from other events? Marcel.
Well, I mean, totally anecdotally, to me, certainly in terms of the timing, everything seems messed up now. Everybody seems having a hard time correctly understanding when things happened. And I guess that's just because the routines, which are normally our pacemakers, were completely destroyed. But that's very anecdotal. So I would defer to a memory science expert.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that, because we know that the people and places and activities of our lives help us to encode information and remember our experiences. And so when you're stuck in your house and all you're doing is basically being in your house and you're staring at your computer screen, the only thing that's basically changing in your day-to-day life are whose faces are inside of little Zoom rectangles. That's not great for memory. But having said that, Maurice, the way we will probably remember this pandemic is probably like how we will remember other culturally significant events. And that is, they are shaped by the stories we share with others. They're shaped by the functions those memories serve, like the life lessons you take away, for example. So did something about your experiences during the pandemic guide how you now think and behave? Did it change how you see yourself in your identity, for instance? Lorraine?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's been very difficult because to keep track of time, even because many of the markers the important life markers we'd expect or enjoy or structure our experiences around just didn't really happen, or they happened in very subdued ways. So I'm thinking like family events, weddings, funerals, holidays, parties, the kind of things we look forward to and we can sort of structure our year around were just flat. So I think that's what makes it hard in autobiographical memory terms, I think, for us thinking about that entire period. Yeah.
Right. Our next question is from Sumatutta in India. What's the relationship between stress and memory loss during COVID? Well, I can say that insofar as the relationship between stress and memory goes in general is that it's complicated. So acute extreme stress is catastrophic for the biochemical processes necessary to make memories more durable. This is known as the process of consolidation, and extreme stress disrupts that whole protein synthesis. Also, highly stressful events shift your attention around and sometimes push you to notice and then later remember things that seem seriously irrelevant. And so, Lorraine, here I'm thinking about Mara Mather's ABC model, for example. But Marcel, Lorraine, Tom, you might have other thoughts too.
I was wondering if perhaps certainly some people would have had acute stress kind of responses, but other people would have developed chronic stress over the period, because you remember when we thought this was going to last for a couple of weeks or whatever.
Yeah, not Marcel.
No, he was wise. But, if people who were shielding for or had, chronic diseases or were at risk or were immunocompromised, I wonder the extent to which they have had experiences of chronic stress over this period. And I think that will be something that will also relate to memory and how this period is remembered. And that fits with the work, a little bit of our working group, Marianne.
Yeah.
There's also this literature now coming out, right, showing actually what an effect COVID had and continues to have on the brain, even in mild cases. So I think there's still some surprises. One of the most interesting things I heard recently at a conference was the phenomenon of what was it called? Anosognosia? Is that possible? Yeah. So the people that had a very stressful and severe COVID infection to the point that they had to go to the hospital, and it had really strong cognitive effects that are durable, but they are unaware to recognize them. Their environment recognizes them, but they don't, and it's a concerning phenomenon, of course.
Yeah.
We're going to try and stick around and answer a few more questions, maybe run over the hour a wee bit. So ask away if you're in the chat. We have another question here. How does aging affect these patterns of data? It's Christy Maltap from Davidson College. Marcel?
Well, so aging in terms of the age of the people using the app, is that right? That's what's likely meant here. Certainly did, but in general, at least from my own personal experience and what I lived through here in Switzerland, obviously the elderly, that piece of communication, it was one of the key pieces that thankfully made it out, right? That the older you are, basically the higher risk. And so the elderly population, right, understood that. And so they were correspondingly eager actually to get their hands on this technology, even though actually, right, it should also have been their younger contacts. Right. And then there was this frustrating experience with Apple making exposure notification initially incompatible, right, with older versions of the phones, because you had to upgrade, right, to iOS 14, if I remember correctly, and that didn't work on older iPhones, which were still very popular in the older population, at least in Europe. I don't know how the situation was elsewhere. Later, they managed to do it, but then the second wave had already passed, and the vaccines were available, so it was less useful at the time.
That's interesting because that is a typical Apple development feature that I've noticed, where they will design for their most recent hardware because it's the most capable, and then just deprecate things and say, well, they're not available to the older systems. And when you're talking about, inessential features, that's fine. So that is something for technology developers to take into account when preparing for the next pandemic. Is you need to target the oldest usable system, the oldest system that's going to be usable out there, and designed for that version of Bluetooth, even if it's not supporting the most current version of Bluetooth. I understand why it's more work to do that, because those systems are less capable, and in some cases you have to encode an entirely different set of code to call an older version of a protocol like Bluetooth than a newer version, and the newer versions tend to be more efficient. But that's something that they'll have to take into account. And I'm glad that they eventually did, but it sounds like it was too late.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What's our next question? Jennifer Tallarico. Is this from her class? I wonder, how dramatically do the properties of the virus influence the behavioral and mnemonic factors, memory factors, during contact tracing? Marcel.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I mean, as I mentioned in the beginning, right? What is a contact completely depends on the disease and how it's transmitted. I mean, the obvious case I always make is that, well, if you're contact tracing for a sexually transmitted disease, right, that looks very different from contact tracing. People have a better memory of sexual encounters than random encounters on the bus, at least most people. And so then also, right, incubation periods obviously have an extremely strong impact, because here, right, we said, look, you just need to remember it's sort of 4, 5, 6 days going back, max 2 weeks. Well, that's already hard enough, but imagine, right, you're talking about something that could have infected someone, a year ago. Those would also be huge challenges. Symptom visibility was in fact a key factor, and I keep reminding people, right, that the fact that this is a virus that you can transmit while not yet showing symptoms is the reason we had a pandemic, right? That wasn't the case with SARS-CoV-1. It only started really heavily transmitting once you started feeling pretty sick, which meant you were probably already staying at home, reducing your contacts, but also contact tracing could really kick in very quickly. Whereas here, right, you had to explain to people, hey, you need to stay at home even if you feel okay, right? Does that make any sense? Sure, right, medically makes a lot of sense, but intuitively this was very, very difficult for people to understand.
Yeah, I just read a prospective study. It was either in JAMA or the New England Journal of Medicine, and in the US, about 12% of people were converting from serologically negative to positive in the course of this prospective study about a recent exposure. And then a total of the sample, about 10% of the total sample, was asymptomatic. I mean, they basically were told, hey, you had COVID. So, I mean, that's, that's not helping. Wei, what else do we have? Laura Hicks wants to know, what is the impact of long-term cognitive issues with memory some people are dealing with, post-COVID infection or future research and preparedness? How has that impacted ongoing research? Lorraine?
Yeah, I haven't been looking for research that is tackling this. I'm pretty sure there will be quite a lot of research tackling this, because obviously the impact of long COVID, even physiologically, never mind cognitively, is likely to be quite devastating for some people. And I wonder, maybe like going forward, is this something that will need to be factored into memory studies, more generally speaking, an assessment of whether there's been an impact of viral infection on cognitive performance?
Yeah, I know that there are other webinars in the APS Global Collaboration Series that will have spoken to these issues. I think the one was on biopsychology. So, Laura, you might look for that. Wei, what else we got? John West, to what extent do you see rose-tinted collective memories resulting from patriotism in certain countries as a threat to future preparedness? Well, I mean, I think, John, no matter what the reason is for how they arise, it's bad news. But yeah, I guess, well, Lorraine, when you were talking about tight and loose cultures, right? Loose cultures tend to have this huge optimism bias, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of feature, I suppose, of not being scarred too heavily historically in similar ways, or not having the existential threat made real too often for you. So, yeah, absolutely, it's likely to be a threat to future preparedness, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what is American exceptionalism if not a collection of rose-colored collective memories, right?
I wonder if patriotism is the issue as much as some sort of tribalism. So
yeah.
I can imagine a situation where the party that you don't agree with is championing the cause of fighting a pandemic, and because it's the party you don't agree with, you start to dismiss the preparations and dismiss the seriousness. It doesn't, it doesn't matter which party it is. It's in a lot of places in the world, not just the United States, but certainly the United States is among them.
Yeah. Not your team.
I mean, the problem is, right, that everything will get politicized, and it's remarkable how in most countries in the first week people were quite in line, right? And sort of, we all for one for all. And then things just started to fall apart, right? The longer this dragged on as things got politicized. Actually, I mean, a bit coincidental, but we did some research on that, mining Twitter data and the conversations globally, right? And who said what publicly. And it's interesting that in the beginning, in the first week, right, the dominant voice was the voice of science. And then, right, in the summer 2020, that started to shift, and then in the fall it was politics. And I mean, I wouldn't want to establish causation here, but it's somewhat telling.
Right. Next question. Allison Sheridan. Didn't home testing make even the digital method of contact tracing less successful? Home testing made us know to stay home. There was no official test, so phones didn't. Marcel, do you have thoughts about this?
Yeah, no, I think actually home testing should in principle have made the whole thing even better, right? Because again, contact tracing is not per se for you when you're already positive, but it's to ensure that whoever you may have given the infection, that's a dead end. I mean, sorry, bad term, right? But you know what I mean, right? In terms of traffic.
A cul-de-sac, yeah.
A cul-de-sac, yeah.
Much nicer.
Much nicer. And so, right, the faster you can get this process going, the better. And so home testing, right, would allow you to kickstart this process much faster. And indeed, some countries eventually started doing that. So the UK, right, you could, with the home test, with this lateral flow test, you could activate the app. The apps, right, as a reminder, had activations in there. So the system would be overrun by trolls, right, who would basically send the whole world into quarantine. But that was exactly a part that took a long time, and sometimes too much time. And then it was epidemiologically irrelevant because too much time had already passed. But the home test, right, would really enable you. So I would imagine, a new version of a contact tracing system in the next pandemic would have that all sort of lined up, right? It just do a test at home. 15 minutes later, you activate the app, done.
Yeah, our home tests in the United States had an app and had a system for reporting that in. But the problem was, by the time most people started taking them, at least in the state of California and a lot of other states, the contact tracing system had been overwhelmed. I think the perception is that it had stopped. It had not. In fact, when my wife tested positive with a PCR, she got a call from the LA Department of Health, and she was registered in the database. She also got an exposure notification like a month and a half ago after attending a concert. So it's still working. it's just overwhelmed. And so by the time the home test came, I think a lot of people just took the test and didn't bother with the app because there wasn't a habit of that being essential.
All right. And I think we've got one last question, Wei. Is that right? Okay. Mario Baldassare, and also shout out to Dr. Baldassare's class who's watching. We are curious to hear more about Marcel's note that the whole class, Marcel, are curious to hear more about Marcel's note that the rate of contact tracing was the same in the NHS app as it was in traditional contact tracing. Why wasn't the app better? Challenge from Mario Baldassare.
Oh yeah, so exactly. So that's this is called the secondary attack rate. Yeah, basically your precision, right? How good are you in identifying the right contact? Well, why wasn't it better? Tough question, because generally the expectation of most people in the field that the app would do worse, right? Because I mean, there were all these shows showing, oh, look how Bluetooth, right, recognizes that person over there, right, 20 meters across the street. So you're going to basically ping everyone, and you're not going to be precise, and it's going to go through walls, right, and all of these arguments that people made. And yet it turned out to be actually quite good, right? Similar to traditional contact tracing. Could we do it better? Possibly we could, but in fact, this was one of the big debates initially among some of the epidemiologists involved in the system, of which there actually weren't that many. Right, there was a big discussion in the beginning. Some people said, you guys shouldn't do this decentralized, which is what exposure notification is. You should do it centralized, right? The central authority has all of this data on a central server, and then the scientists can go through the data in real time and learn things about this virus, like what is, and tune the knobs and to make the system more precise. And I agree, right? That would potentially have made the system slightly more precise, but it would have come at this massive cost of a risk of large scale surveillance being misused later. So now, hopefully, right, we can do experiments, small groups, and try to figure this out more precisely, so that when the next time something like this come along, we have better data how to do this. I mean, have you noticed that the world has just found out that most respiratory viruses don't spread through droplets or through airborne, right? It's 2022. We understand these damn viruses down to the angstrom, right? In terms of, oh, this molecules then goes like this, right? But we don't even understand how they spread. So finally, right, we're getting a grip on these things, and we realize how important this stuff is. Sorry for the French.
No, I mean, we should be grateful to you and all public health officials and epidemiologists. We're going to wrap this up. I want to thank all the folks at APS for their hard work. A lot of people behind the scenes. I particularly want to thank Ludmilla Nunes, Emily Proppy, and Andy DeSoto, who's now at the NSF. And thank you to our panelists, Lorraine Hope, Tom Merritt, Marcel Salate. Please do stay tuned to your emails to watch a recording of this event, and check out the APS website at psychologicalscience.org for past events that are part of the APS COVID collaboration, and particularly if you're a psychological scientist or a student of psychological science, there's a whole lot more in there. If you want to follow work from my lab, you can follow me here at the Gary Lab or at Dr. Lambchop on Twitter. And where can people learn more about your work, Lorraine?
I'm at the University of Portsmouth, so you can find more on my website here, or follow me on Twitter, or drop me an email. All good.
Okay. And Marcel?
Yeah, sure. I'm also on Twitter and online, but probably the best is just to go to Google Scholar and see what we're up to, scientifically speaking.
Right. And Tom?
dailytechnewsshow.com if you want to get the tech news that we were referring to, and you can just search for Tom Merritt on Twitter, and my ridiculous username will pop up, and follow me there.
Okay. I want to thank everybody in the audience for watching too, and thanks to our producer, Wei Ming Chan, and we'll catch you all at the next pandemic. Until then, play us out, Wei.
in 1919. Yes, men and women was dying. With that stuff, which the doctors call the flu. People died everywhere. Death went creeping through the air. And the groans of the rich sure was sad.